Welcome to the Her Story Circle podcast, the podcast that brings you the extraordinary tales of everyday women who are changing the world. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Every week, we dive into the lives, challenges, and triumphs of women from all four corners of the globe. We're here to inspire, enlighten, and connect, sharing stories that uplift and empower. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and join us as we explore the incredible journeys of women shaping our future. This is Her Story, where every woman's voice matters. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Her Story Circle. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another intriguing young woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor to have a new best friend all the way in Australia. My name is Lauren Carpenter. I'm based in Sacramento, California, so all the way in the United States. And I'm here to share my story. I think my story starts as a very young girl. I am the oldest of two, so I have a younger sister. But for the first 7 years of my life, I was an only child. And my parents are both lawyers who really raised me from a very early age that, right and wrong and the scales of justice, right? These were really important things in our family and in how we looked at the world. And so I think starting at like 3 or 4, we would have political debates at the dinner table and discuss issues of the day. I was a very opinionated, I probably still am, but I was a very opinionated child. And so, again, my parents really cultivated having opinions on, issues of the world and debating those opinions and sort of finding merit in all sides of an argument. So that started very young. As I shared, I have a younger sister who was born when I was 7. So I think in a lot of ways that shaped my worldview as well, because now not only did I have my opinions formed very early, right? But I also had this small little baby doll, and I wanted to create a better world for her and help inform her worldview and her understanding of the world around her as well. So I would say I always grew up with a really strong sense of right and wrong and a very, I think, clear point of view on what that meant and how that should shape how my life moved forward. So, fast forward as a college-aged kid, I studied policy and history because I think in order to understand policy in a lot of ways, you have to understand what's come before us and how that shapes our behavior into the future. And then after graduating college, I started working in policy. So as you can see, there's a really clear through line there from a very early age of being really interested in the issues of the day and opinionated about them, to say the least. So, I spent my early 20s really working on policy issues. Sort of you name the policy issue, and I've probably worked in it. Education, retail, restaurants, energy, transportation. I was fortunate to work with a small but mighty team that really focused on legislation and regulation that ran the gamut. And I think that was very formative for me because what I realized, I found my passion, right? What I realized is I had spent my entire life up to that point really focused on policy. But the reality is policy, once it becomes a policymaking process, is messy. And it isn't that perfect thing that you can debate, just on principle. It becomes this messy thing that you have to wrangle into reality. And so I found my niche and I found my passion in building bridges. I developed, I think, a strong skill set in taking complex policy issues and really explaining them to the people. Because as I said, the policy making process, it's often referred to as how sausage is made, which is gross. And I think I also, in turn, really served as a bridge to policymakers, understanding how the people, their constituents, felt about issues and helping to translate those beliefs and those concerns and those passions into things, that would be relevant for policymakers as they were working on policy. So that bridge, what I realized is, irrespective of the policy area, I was passionate about being that bridge, about being that translator, and I think really facilitating understanding among audiences that don't necessarily always understand one another. So then I went into cannabis. I think, in the state of California where I live, cannabis was legalized in 2016. It was a multi-year process that actually started as a legislative effort that was unsuccessful, but ultimately then resulted in voters taking the issue, to the ballot box and voting to approve cannabis legalization in California, which, depending on the day, is either the fifth or the fourth largest economy in the world. So huge, right? A huge development. And while I had not necessarily ever seen myself as a young girl working in cannabis or cannabis policy, as that was happening in my home state and really watching all of the voices weighing in on that process, I came to feel like it was my calling, it was my duty to serve, to bring my skills as a bridge between policymakers and, cannabis operators, bring that into this new arena. Because I think, California legalized cannabis and a lot of folks feel like, okay, we've said yes, now what? And so I really saw it as an opportunity to enter into what had long been a community and help sort of translate concerns from the community to policymakers, and also in a lot of ways take my background and understanding of policy and translate that into the cannabis community. So I started that in about 2018, which feels like a lifetime ago. We often joke in cannabis, it's like dog years. And so, I started by working for a couple of other companies in cannabis in California that were really at the forefront of implementing retail dispensaries post-legalization. And after doing that for other operators for a couple of years, I woke up, I sort of joke, I had a quarter life crisis, right? I knew being that bridge was my calling, but I also could just feel instinctually that I wasn't necessarily in the right spaces and serving in the right places to be an effective bridge. And so I just had this gut instinct that I needed to do it myself. So fast forward and here we are. So I sort of jumped off the cliff and started my own cannabis retail company in California. Ended up co-founding it with my husband, which has been a wild ride to start a retail company at the beginning of a pandemic with my partner. But almost 5 years later, I think in a lot of ways we are now working to really actively reshape perceptions around cannabis in California. And importantly, I think really rolling up our sleeves and having the tough conversations about cannabis in small communities, often conservative communities across California, where we sit down sort of cup of coffee by cup of coffee with pastors and parents and school board members and regulators and city council members and everybody in between, and really talk through their fears around, what cannabis being in their community could look like, and also really explore the opportunities of cannabis being in their community. So I like to say we're sort of destigmatizing cannabis cup of coffee by cup of coffee, personal interaction by personal interaction. But when you take a step back in doing that, I believe strongly that we are serving as that bridge between cannabis consumers and a community that has existed in our state for generations, and the policymakers and legislators and others who, don't necessarily understand the intricacies of that community that I so revere. So it's been a wild ride. And then I will also just add, in furtherance of that mission for destigmatization, We have started integrating on-site cannabis sales and consumption into some of the world's largest events. So taking that four walls of our dispensary experience and making it much, much bigger.
Wow. What an incredible journey you've been on. It's inspiring to see a woman entering this industry, and especially in such conservative regions of the world. So, what has been your biggest challenge that you faced in winning over, say, local governments?
It's a great question. And I think the biggest challenge is one question. It comes down to one question almost every single time. And that is, what about our kids? Every community cares, whether you have children or not. And I'm blessed to have just had my first daughter 7 months ago. So it's definitely given me a new and unique perspective on this conversation. But, every community cares about its youth. And I think rallies in a lot of ways to protect its youth, and particularly the most vulnerable. And so it's a natural question for that community to say, we're telling kids that they shouldn't be using these substances, and yet we're legalizing them and normalizing them, right? And there's a tension in that. And so I think that's the biggest challenge, is how to facilitate honest conversations about that concern, and how to make sure, as an operator, I'm being respectful and really listening to those concerns rather than just dismissing them.
So besides that tension, how do you navigate the tension between profit and purpose?
I think by being purpose-driven. I think, when I look to, my company is called Embarc. When we started Embarc, we really built community into our DNA from day one. Okay. We do that in a million ways. It would take me this entire conversation to talk about all of the ways that we do that. But, core to that is, as I mentioned, it's cup of coffee by cup of coffee with community members. And through that process, we actually create a community advisory board in each community of local volunteers who sit with us for the lifetime of the business and help shape our community giving and our community philanthropic efforts. And so by centering community in the soul of our business, I think that our perspective is and always will be first and foremost driven by that purpose to destigmatize responsibly and in community.
I love that. Now, can you describe a moment when you knew that your business was making a real impact?
Yes. And thank goodness for them, right? Because they keep us going in that purpose-driven space.
Yeah.
I'll share my most recent. Just this weekend, I was working the cash register. We were doing sales and consumption at a large festival in the city of Monterey here in California. And I was ringing out a customer when someone else walked up to me and he said, Lauren, I have to talk to you for a minute. And he introduced himself to me, and he's actually a resident who lives about 500 feet from one of our dispensary locations.
Okay.
And he said, I was so excited to see you at this festival because I have to tell you this story. And, you always get a little nervous, like, oh gosh, what does that mean, right? And he said to me, when we all found out in the neighborhood that a dispensary was going to be opening, in his case, like 500 feet from his house, we were pretty nervous, right? This is where they raise their children and where they have their families. And he shared with me that every single day, 2 of our employees walk through the neighborhood and pick up trash. And he said, we now, as a neighborhood, we all talk about, oh, we just saw the Embarc guys, walking down the street or whatever. And he was sharing with me how important that was in destigmatizing cannabis and cannabis businesses with a lot of his neighbors. And so that's a small example. It's, it's not the biggest or the most formative for us, but it is absolutely, a reminder and a reinforcement of why we build community into our DNA. Because ultimately, it's what ladders up to this broader goal of destigmatization.
Yes. So how has motherhood influenced your leadership style?
Wow. In so many ways, I am the most type A control freak. I mean, I probably just drive my poor team absolutely crazy. In a highly regulated industry, you feel the need to try and control. always.
Yes.
And I had an unexpectedly very difficult pregnancy and a very difficult birth. And so what I can say is that experience humbled me in ways that I never anticipated, that I never could have imagined. And it forced me, for, the control freak in me had no choice but to submit to the fact that my body and my life was really outside of, in some ways, my control. And I think that was so critical in helping me. We've been a startup for 4.5 years, and it's time to start to shift in our thinking and in our approach. And I have to trust our team and their expertise. I have to trust their intuition and their, capabilities.
Yeah.
And I think becoming a mother in the way that I did, it forced me to relinquish control and really allow the team that we've spent almost 5 years building to flourish. And I'm thrilled that they did, and they have. And I think it's really helped to reshape as I reintegrate into the business. I was fortunate to be able to take a couple of months off with Emery when she was born. But as I reintegrate into the business, it is allowing me to be more of the leader I want to be and less of the doer that I've felt called to be in the first 4 years of our business.
I love it. So what strategies do you use to engage that skeptical community and regulators around your business?
The biggest strategy, there's no sexy secret here. The biggest strategy is conversation. It's creating a safe space for folks to be skeptical. I think the cannabis industry, particularly in the United States, the public has faced a lot of misinformation.
Yeah.
And that's really rooted in decades of, we sort of call it reefer madness, right? And so unfortunately, these decades of misinformation have left the industry at a huge disadvantage because we don't have sufficient medical studies and information on, benefits and risks, right? We don't have, I think, real dialogue. Our dialogue has always been politicized for decades at this point around this plant. And so I think the most important tool in our tool chest is, it's easy to be defensive in the face of that and to fight for what I know is right, what I've seen with my own 2 eyes. But being defensive just puts the person at the other side of the table on defense, right? They maybe have decades of programming that they need to work through in these conversations. And so the biggest tool is the easiest one, I think, and it's grace, right? It's starting the conversation by allowing folks to be authentically who they are and authentic in how they feel about cannabis. Because if I don't acknowledge their starting point, if I ask them to start at my starting point, then candidly, we're never going to get there.
It's so true. So why is community reinvestment such a core part of your business model, and how are you going about doing it?
It's a great question. I think it's central to our model for 2 reasons. The first is because is selfish. And so maybe I'll say, the second, the second is because I know that as one human being, I can only make so much impact, right? Economically, in time, in all sorts of resources. But across a business with hundreds of employees and the capacity of that, our impact can be so much greater. And so I think it's really important to build community into our DNA and into our approach, because I know that collectively, I'm not going to say we could change the world, but I think we are changing the conversation in a really important way during a time where the world is having a conversation about this plant. And I think that matters. And I think that helps to give our team purpose. And what greater gift can you help provide someone than purpose every day, right? As opposed to a job. I think the other thing is we have to honor who and what has come before us. I have only existed in the cannabis industry for, nearly a decade. So basically since legalization. And I am standing on the shoulders of so many people, so many activists, so many renegades, so many folks who are willing to take risk to fight for access to a plant that has been politicized for a really long time. And so I have to build community. I feel called to build community into what we build, because before cannabis was an industry, it was a community. And that's the way that I can honor, we all, I think, can honor what's come before us. We all view our role in doing that differently. But that, from my perspective, is how I can honor those folks who have sacrificed so much to get us here. And in a lot of ways, I feel like it's how I can pick up the torch and do my small part, right, in helping to get us there.
So how do you ensure diversity and inclusion within your leadership and hiring practices?
It's a great question. And I think there isn't one answer, right? I think it's through a variety of efforts, intentional and hopefully over time, right, unintentional, because you've built a diverse and inclusive team. I think, it's funny you asked the question. Our first store opened in Tahoe 4.5 years ago. And we, at the time, we had hired a number of members of the LGBTQ community in our leadership team. And on the second or third day, one of them turns to me with this big smile on her face. And she said, "Did you mean to hire the only lesbians in Tahoe?" And I just started cracking up, right? And I sort of said to her, yes, we intended to hire a team that reflects the community we serve. And we do that by empowering members of this community, right, to make those critical decisions. And so I think that, the short answer to your question is by empowering people who reflect the communities they serve to build teams that do the same.
Oh, I love it. So what role do you see cannabis playing in the broader conversations around social justice?
I think cannabis is a very interesting example of the dangers of stigma and politicized conversations, right? At its core, cannabis is a plant that we are, I think, anecdotally, certainly able to see has significant medicinal benefit. I say anecdotally because, again, politics has suppressed our ability to sufficiently, at this point, study, and we're starting to see these studies being published. But I think the science around this has been depressed for a long time because of politics. But I think ultimately it is a shining example of how we have to have honest conversations and pragmatic conversations about the realities of our communities, right? And the realities of, the reality of this plant is that it has been politicized, and it is that politicization that has prevented us from accessing something that can help a lot of people. I also think cannabis is a helpful, particularly in the United States. It's a very tough conversation for a lot of people to have, but it is also an example of shining a light on, cannabis was a tool used by some to criminalize low-income communities and communities of color. And we can look at the multi-generational impact of that, right? And we can look at the gross inequities, the folks who don't look like me, who aren't in a position to do what I'm doing by virtue of the fact that they don't look like me and haven't had the opportunities that I've had. I don't think we figured out that conversation yet. I think brave voices are pushing really hard in California and beyond to have the conversation around what does inequity, and by extension, sort of righting that wrong, look like in cannabis. Again, I don't think we've gotten it right, but I think there are important voices that are pushing that conversation forward. And I think it's important that we continue to do that because, again, I think cannabis has been a tool that's been used to criminalize. And we have to stop and say, what are the, again, multi-generational impacts of that decision? And based on really assessing that, what are the viable solutions, and how do we implement solutions that achieve their intended result, as opposed to sort of feel good or are a great talking point, right? I think the last thing criminalized communities need is sort of more lip service.
So what other myths about cannabis and its users would you like to bust?
Oh boy. I think, I think the biggest myth is, and I still see this a lot in these community conversations, there is still this stereotype that cannabis users are lazy stoners. There are, very tough, awkward conversations around, and they shouldn't be tough or awkward, by the way, around cannabis use and different stakeholder groups. I'm a mom. I'm a new mom. And I've now been sort of ushered into this mom tribe by other women in our industry who have all shared that there is a lot of shame and stigma around conversations around cannabis use as a parent, as a working professional, as someone perceived as successful. And I think the data is showing us that the fastest growing segments of cannabis users are older Americans, right? And so this perception that cannabis is, a substance used by lazy, youth and youth that are off the right track, couldn't be further from the truth. But I think until those of us who consume cannabis, that break that stereotype, until there's an environment where more of those folks feel comfortable talking about their cannabis use, we're sort of stuck in that trap.
Wow. It's amazing, but it's awesome to see how far you've come so far in this industry. Now, my last two questions are a bit of a thought experiment. In the first one, I'm going to teleport you back to that younger woman who went into a world or a field where there's very, very few women going into this taboo industry. If you could go back and give yourself 3 nuggets of wisdom, just in case there's other women out there who are wanting to enter industries that are a no-no for women, what 3 nuggets of wisdom would you give around business, about life? What would you like somebody to have said to you before you started?
It's a great question. I think the first that has been a driving truth for me, both in, my work with Embarc, but also I think just generally, is to trust your gut. I think as women, we are often sort of conditioned to suppress that gut instinct because we're made to feel like there's always someone smarter or more qualified in the room. And I think, newsflash, what I've learned is you're in the right room if there's always someone smarter or more qualified in the room, right? That's a room where you grow. That's a room where you learn. And so you can't be afraid to be in those places and in those spaces. But I also think we have a very innate, very divine female intuition honed over centuries, right? And I think that we have to trust that intuition with people, with opportunities, with the places and the spaces we occupy. Because for me, I've found, to the extent I have regrets, I don't really believe in regrets, but where I kind of, I wish I had done something differently, 100% of the time, that was a choice where I wasn't being led by my gut. So I think that's the biggest sort of foundational perspective I have there. I think the next is to be in service to others. We talked a lot about, community sort of as part of your DNA, purpose, having a calling. Life is too short. As a new mom, I'm really learning this as my priorities sort of rapidly reorganize, right, around this little soul I've brought into the world. And I think life is too short to be chasing success or a specific outcome. I think success or favorable outcomes are the byproduct of really feeling passionately about where you put your energy. and having a kid that's keeping me up all night it's reminding me we only have so much energy. And so when I am really mission driven and mission focused, when I am really answering questions and meeting challenges through the lens of being a change agent and being in service to others, I'm really proud of the outcome of that. And at the end of my life, when I'm 100 years old, I want to feel proud of the ways that I've showed up for others and contributed. And then I think the third thing I would remind myself and others, especially when you're starting something new, if you're starting your own business, is that there is no perfect deal if it's with the wrong person or the wrong people. When you have a vision, when you have this belief, this confidence in yourself and in what you believe that you can build or what you see, what you think you can manifest, sometimes, a seemingly perfect thing comes along, a seemingly perfect deal or opportunity or partner. But again, I think you really have to trust your gut and you have to check that opportunity through that lens of, am I in service to others? Because if that opportunity is with the wrong person, it sort of doesn't matter how perfect it is. I just don't think it will ultimately, be realized in the way that you envision. So I think those are the three.
Fantastic. Last question. And I think I should have asked this earlier, right up front. What are the medicinal qualities of cannabis? And what do you think this is all going to look like when you're 100 years old? There's a lot of noise right now, but if you project into the future, what kind of a legacy would you like your life to have been a part of? Give us the medicinal qualities first.
I think the medicinal qualities piece, the thing that's so fascinating about cannabis is that each of our bodies has an endocannabinoid system that processes cannabis differently. So said differently, you and I could consume the exact same thing and have wildly different effects from it. And so that's what makes it really hard to answer that question, because each body is so unique, and therefore the effects, the impacts, and the opportunities of this plant look different for everyone. I think many of us at this point know, whether it's a friend or a relative, so many of us now know someone who, has suffered from seizures or cancer or debilitating pain or PTSD or, right? That list goes on, who, for whatever reason have found their way to cannabis and who have been able to sort of anecdotally share, wow, that was really transformational for me, right? Wow, that, that was an incredible alternative to opioids, which certainly in America, we need alternatives to opioids, right? Or, wow, my aunt was deeply suffering with cancer, and cannabis played a huge role in preserving her appetite, which allowed her to maintain some strength, which allowed her to, fight this battle in her own body. My own husband, his father had a brain aneurysm that burst, and he suffered long-term impacts of that. While the doctors were able to save his life, fortunately, the long-term impacts of that were seizures. And cannabis, actually, forget the 12 medications they had him on after, the brain aneurysm surgery. Cannabis was the thing that was able to get those seizures under control. So, again, its medicinal potential, I think, is hyper unique and ultimately completely understudied because those efforts have been suppressed. And so one of the exciting things is, I believe over the course of my lifetime, we will be able to medically and scientifically really answer that question. And I think that's important progress. As our medicine gets further and further away from plants and more and more and more synthetic, I'm enthused at, the opportunity to see plant-based medicine in my lifetime. Yeah. And then in terms of what comes next, that is a crystal ball that I would love to have, especially right now in America. It feels impossible to answer a question every day. It feels like there's, a new development. But
Yeah.
I think, when we think, I don't like comparisons between cannabis and alcohol, but I think what's important is they've both suffered under prohibition, right? And so in the United States, alcohol is a number of decades, nearly a century really, since prohibition. And cannabis often as an industry gets compared to alcohol.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways that gives me hope, because if we're looking at alcohol, I'm not suggesting that model is the right model for our industry, but it is a stable model, right?
Yeah.
And so we are less than 10 years into legalization. We are not, I'm bad at sports, but that feels like the first inning of a baseball game to me, right? Like we are in legal cannabis's infancy. And so what I hope over my lifetime is really to see the maturation of a market. It's my hope that market, like other industries, has space and works to protect craft and legacy in that market. But ultimately, it's my hope that market proliferates such that folks here and everywhere have access to plant as, an option for them in medicine.
Oh, I love it. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for coming online and enlightening our community with your business knowledge, your knowledge around cannabis, and the work that you're doing in the space to bring it to the mainframe. I think a lot of people want to learn more, need this information, and you're just doing an amazing job doing that. Thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody who tuned in. The Her Story Circle is not just a podcast. We're a social impact movement that brings you the stories and voices of women from all over the world. We share our stories to uplift you, to inspire you, to energize you, to educate you, but most importantly, to take you from where you are now to where you're trying to go. So you might know somebody who's in extreme pain, somebody who's looking for a solution to a medical problem. Reach out. Lauren is there to get more information. Reach out to experts who can give you the knowledge that you need to tap into plant-based medicines to solve your health issues as well. So I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody, with yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world, and bye for now. Lauren, thanks again for the interview. Don't go away. Thank you for tuning into the Her Story Circle podcast. I hope today's story has inspired you to believe in the power of our stories and the difference you can make in the world when you use your voice. I'm Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a rich tapestry of diverse perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these stories with more listeners. Follow us on social media by looking for the Her Story Circle podcast for more updates. And join us tomorrow for another episode filled with courage, resilience, and empowerment. Remember, your story matters, and together we're building a stronger, more inclusive world. Until next time, keep making her story.